Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Emily Bowe, the Assistant Director of the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. You're joining us today for our lunchtime program with Dr. Kelly Erby about her 2016 book, Restaurant Republic, The Rise of Public Dining in Boston, as part of our programming efforts around our current exhibition, Building Blocks. But before we begin our program today, I want to take note of the complicated and contested threads that are woven through historical geography, including difficult stories that we neither can nor should ignore. The place we now call Boston is the ancestral and current home to Indigenous peoples. The Massachusetts people lived here for thousands of years and still live today on the Shawmut Peninsula. The metropolitan region is also home to other tribes, including Mashpee and Aquinnah-Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. Copley Square, where the center is located, sits atop a tidal estuary that once featured some of the most advanced marine agricultural techniques in North America. The maps that are in the Boston Public Library's collection bear witness not only to histories of colonial expropriation, but also to conflicts ranging from labor struggles to racial segregation. In some cases, these maps don't simply document these stories, but they actually played a role in making them happen in the first place. Through all of the programs and interpretation at the Leventhal Center, we encourage visitors to consider how these histories still exert real effects on the present day. Today's talk, as I mentioned, is part of our ongoing exhibition, Building Blocks, Boston Stories from Urban Atlases. If you've tuned into with us before, you're familiar, but I will give an explanation in case you haven't gotten a chance to see the show yet. In Building Blocks, which is free to visit 6 days a week in our gallery at the Central Library in Copley Square, we use a remarkable series of atlases that stretch from approximately the US Civil War to the Second World War that detail the lives, properties, buildings, and neighborhoods of ordinary Bostonians at a fine detail of scale that invite questions and about individual lives and individual stories. These atlases are significant not only for their amazing detail, but also because they allow us a window into a Boston of the past as it morphed from a colonial city into a regional metropolis. The physical changes we see in individual blocks and neighborhoods mirror the scale of social change taking place in Boston between the 1860s and the 1940s. And in today's talk, we'll explore the ways that changes in food and dining culture during this period gave rise to new urban spaces in the city, while also reinforcing existing divisions of race, ethnicity, gender, and class. So now I'll go ahead and welcome Dr. Kelly Erby to the screen as I briefly introduce her. Dr. Erby is a professor of history and interim dean at the College of Arts and Sciences at Washburn University. She received a BA in history and English from the Ohio State University and her PhD in history from Emory University. She's the author of the book we're going to be talking about today. Oops, my blur is on, but Restaurant Republic. I've got the BPL's copy here. And she lives in Lawrence, Kansas with her two sons, and I believe is joining us from Lawrence today. So welcome, Kelly. We're glad you're here.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I'm actually joining you from Washburn University, which is in Topeka,
Okay.
Kansas. Yeah, the capital of Kansas, for those who may not know. And I'm so excited to return to this research. The book came out in 2016, and I've turned to other projects since then. So it was kind of like revisiting an old friend to prepare for this talk. I'm gonna share some slides with you all. Yes, there we go. And so the main thing I want to focus on for today is this question: how did Boston's early eateries help a young United States define itself? My research focuses on the first half of the 19th century, and I go into the second half as well, but it's really like the 1820s and 1830s that I focus on in the project. And obviously that's when a young United States is really kind of trying to figure out who it is culturally and socially and how it's going to live up to its revolutionary ideals. So I want to begin, though, by sharing the anecdote with which I also begin my book. So in May 1857, Benjamin Crowninshield, who was a Harvard student from an affluent Boston family, purchased some raw oysters from a shop near Quincy Market and ate them with his friend John. He referred to this late afternoon activity as oystering. 2 days later, Crowninshield enjoyed a dish of ice cream with a female friend at a local confectioner shop. And he began the next week by meeting classmates for supper at the Parker House Hotel, one of Boston's preeminent dining spots, with a menu consisting largely of fashionable French cuisine. Tuesday found Crowninshield back at Parker's for his afternoon meal, as did Wednesday. On Friday, which was class day at Harvard, Crowninshield stopped again for oysters at Lyon's Oyster Saloon in Cambridge. And this time he ate the bivalves for breakfast, which does not sound appealing to me, I have to say, but it was apparently not uncommon in those days to eat oysters for breakfast. And after participating in the festivities that day at Harvard, Crowninshield once more met friends at Parker's, where he ate so much that, as he confided to his diary later that night, I had to relieve myself by inserting my fingers in my throat till my stomach came up. So this snapshot of one Bostonian's springtime dining activities is reflective, I think, of just how commonplace dining out had become in urban America by the mid-19th century. Crowninshield, young and privileged, was able to partake of some of the finest restaurants in Boston, and he clearly overindulged on at least this one occasion. But by this time, it was not just the elite who participated in the new urban trend of commercial dining. By the 1850s, in cities like Boston, there was a dining venue to fit every taste and pocketbook. So that's how I begin my book, and that's how I wanted to begin today. But I want to then acknowledge that dining out had not always been such a common part of urban life. Throughout the colonial and very early national periods, Americans hardly ever ate outside their homes. It's true that taverns were legally obligated to provide meals to travelers and hosted the occasional political or civic banquet, but as a rule, the vast majority of Americans. Then, beginning in the 1820s, the city of Boston played a significant role in helping to change this and in making restaurants a major part of the urban American experience. In addition, Boston's restaurants served to help the city and to some extent the young country define itself as relatively egalitarian, increasingly market-driven and oriented, and diverse and cosmopolitan. So that's kind of what I want to focus on today, is, again, how did Boston's early eateries help the United States define itself? But first, I want to spend some time just kind of unpacking the reasons Bostonians and other urban Americans began to dine in restaurants around this time. So the first reason is that there was all this heightened economic activity in the early stages of industrialization that historians refer to as the market revolution. And this really affected the port town of Boston, which had long been an entry for goods imported from abroad and American agricultural products intended for export. But by the 1820s, it also becomes a hub for manufactured items like shoes and textiles arriving from rural parts of Massachusetts. It also becomes a powerful financial center. And then eventually, Boston also developed manufacturing and industry within the city itself, largely thanks to the tremendous influx of Irish immigrants after 1845. This resulted in the steady separation of work from home, right? So you're now going to work in one of these factories, or you're going to work on the docks, or you're going to work in an office or a bank, and you're not at home when hunger strikes. And then this development was complemented by the steady geographic expansion of the city thanks to early landfill projects. And here's where I get to show some maps. So this is Boston in 1807, and I think it's Oscar Hanlon who described Boston then as a spidery peninsula. And I love that description. But thanks to these landfill projects, the city steadily expands, right, geographically throughout the century. So here we have 1841, and then we've got 1856 and 1886. So you can see the city, getting bigger. And so whereas here, most of the city, most of the population, they lived and worked within just a 2-mile radius before 1820. But you can see as the century goes on, you're just farther away. Like, it's more likely that you're going to be farther away from where you started out. So this all makes returning home to eat your midday meal really difficult, especially given the very limited amount of time that many workers were given to eat. So that's one reason that you have Bostonians going out to eat more often. And this results in a particular genre of eateries that we'll talk about more in a minute. But another reason for the growth of restaurants is that there was an increasing desire among elite Bostonians for public commercial spaces in which to demonstrate their refinement and cultural power, right? And so that results in another particular genre of eatery. Also the booming population. Oh, well, and within this genre, this sort of more elite genre, there's also like a special subset of eateries that were earmarked as safe spaces for women to go out in and demonstrate their refinement. So that's yet another kind of genre of eatery in this period. And then you've got just the overall booming population in the city, especially with the arrival of Irish immigrants and the consequent housing shortage that resulted in cramped living conditions. This made restaurants attractive spaces to socialize during leisure time when the workday is over. And you also have this immigrant population contains many bachelors who increasingly turn to restaurants to feed them a taste of, their familiar cuisine in their new home of Boston. So sort of so-called ethnic eateries are another particular genre of eatery that I'll get into here in a second. So by the 1830s, 1840s, certainly by the 1850s, Boston hosted an expansive but stratified spectrum of eateries, from sophisticated downtown hotel dining rooms specializing in trendy French cuisine to cheap basement eating houses near the wharves and factories, from refined ladies' confectioners to North End Italian table d'hote and Chinese chop stew houses, as they were called, scattered along Harrison Avenue. There were soon as many restaurants in Boston as there were appetites. And just this is kind of a density map showing where the greatest concentration of restaurants were located. I think this is 1850s. And so you can see that they are concentrated down in the commercial hub of the city. So in my book, I closely examined 4 different genres of eateries in Boston in the 1800s: luxury restaurants, inexpensive men's eating houses, refined ladies' dining rooms, and ethnic cafes. And these various genres were distinguished from one another by the different clientele they attracted, the prices they charged, the level of the varying levels of service they provided, etc. And I'm going to go through each of these genres in a little bit more detail in a minute. But I do want to acknowledge first that the trends that led to Bostonians dining in restaurants were not unique to Boston. On the contrary, they occurred in other major northeastern cities like Philadelphia and New York around the same time. And it is true that by the 1840s, New York overtook Boston as America's restaurant capital. But I also want to point out that the distinction of hosting America's first restaurant belongs to Boston. This is supposed to be an image of an eatery known as Julian's Restaurador, which culinary historians acknowledge as the first restaurant in America, and it opened in 1793. Boston was also home to the Tremont House Hotel, opened in 1829, and acknowledged as the world's original luxury hotel. So that first also belongs to Boston. The Tremont was also equipped with truly posh public restaurant where guests of the hotel and local residents could dine in luxury and splendor. And here's sort of where it was located. So I think it's important to note that Boston was home to these culinary firsts, if you will. And also, I think, and I argue in my book, that Boston's emergent restaurant landscape also helped to shape American appetites in more meaningful ways as well, besides just being, where these firsts were located. Okay, so I want to focus now on the expansive but stratified spectrum of eateries and connect this to American developing society and culture at the time. So let's see. Where am I? Oh, I'm going to go back to this image here of all of the eateries. Okay, so let's use the example of the Tremont House Hotel as an example of one way Bostonians work to sort out some of the complexities in their increasingly hierarchical society, how they work to reconcile those divisions with their sort of revolutionary ideals about egalitarianism. Okay, so we'll skip ahead to this. This is the interior of the main dining room at the Tremont House Hotel, drawn in 1852. So we've got I just want to point out a few things about this. This was the most elegant eatery, right? When it opened, it was acknowledged to be the most elegant eatery in the United States. You can see that everyone in the room is a man, a white man. The waiters were men, the diners were men. It's a very well appointed public dining room. You can see sort of the table, everyone's sitting around this U-shaped banquet table. The practice of dining at separate tables comes later. I'll get to that in a minute. But everyone would have sat down, like meals were served at one particular time. It wasn't come and go. So you would, when it was dinner, and dinner is still the main meal of the day, it's the biggest, most extravagant meal. So if you were a guest at the hotel, or if you just had stopped for dinner, the midday dinner, you would show up, you would sit down. Waiters would bring food that had been, whereas in taverns, they would put all the meal on the table at the same time. At the Tremont House Hotel, they initiated this more sophisticated style of dining where the diners would take your order and plate your food, behind the scenes and then bring it out to you. So you can see some of that going on here in this image. The Tremont House specialized in French cuisine, which was sort of by this point acknowledged as the most sophisticated food. If you know French very well, this is a close-up. Americans took liberties with their French. The spelling is not always right. The accent marks are not always in the right place, or they're slanted the wrong way. You can see that they sort of mix more American kinds of foods with French food. So they're kind of adapting it for their own purposes. But French food was very trendy at the time. Let's look next at an eating house. So this is the cover of my book. I love this image. This is the interior of what I'm calling a chaotic men's eating house. And you can see that, it's very different from the Tremont House, right? Where everyone is sitting and using their best manners and would have worn nice clothing, etc. Here, men eat very, very quickly. They're trying to get back to work as quickly as possible. They're smoking, they're, bellying up to the bar and eating. So very different. There were all kinds of urban rumors that went on about like the kinds of food that eating houses cooked, right? There was this perennial rumor about hash, right? Which it had been composed of like little bits of leftover food from everybody's plates. And then they would gather it up and reheat it and serve it to someone else. So a little bit of suspicion about these places as well. Alcohol, it was common for alcohol to be served in these kinds of places. I think you can see a man tipping back maybe, some alcoholic beverage perhaps. There were also, it's really interesting to me that there were different subsets of eating houses. So this is a much less chaotic eating house, more orderly, if you will. The men are sitting down. The waiters are bringing them their food. I don't know if one man is maybe praying, but these may have been, were often like dry, so they did not serve alcohol. These probably would have been a little bit more expensive, but you can see like too, this one looks to be above ground, whereas this one was probably down in the basement, very like poorly lit and ventilated. This one looks a little bit lighter. Air circulation may have been better, maybe not have smelled quite the same. I would love to be able to go back in time and visit these places to really know what they were like. So that's another example of an eating house. I wanted to show an example of eating house license. I was really excited when I found these, but you would take out a license to open up an eating house. Okay, so then this is another genre. This would have been, it's actually, I think this is very interesting. It's from sheet music. It adorned the cover of some sheet music, the Ice Cream Quick Step, printed in Boston. But I use this to illustrate the concept of a ladies' eatery. So there were, throughout the century, more elite women who would also, have reason to find themselves out of their homes at midday, not for work, because the occupations open to women, working women, poor working class women, were primarily domestic or things that they did within their home. So working class women didn't have the same need to eat out in the middle of the day as working men did. But affluent women may have gone into the city to shop or to perhaps do some volunteer work of some sort. And so they may have needed to go out, or, it was also a form of entertainment, another way of sort of demonstrating their cultural capital. And so there were a growing number of eateries that opened that catered specifically to women. Now, men were allowed, and you can see men in this venue here. Men were permitted if they were escorting women. Typically, the waiters were also male. So they were not female exclusive, but they were considered safe. Respectable women could go here. Now, there were also rumors that circulated about these places. And there were, always little stories in women's magazines and even in newspapers about, sort of conjecturing that the male and female couples at some of these tables might not have been actually married, right? Like, how do you know that the man that woman is dining with is her husband? Maybe it's her suitor. So there was, again, suspicion, but nonetheless, affluent women did go into these spaces. Here you can see that there's private tables, and so at these spaces you could go in, you can order a meal, whenever you wanted. It wasn't like at the Tremont House Hotel where meals were served at one time. And I think the separate tables also kind of gave an illusion of greater privacy to these women, which would have been something that they would have expected. Oh, here's just another example of a space where you can see men and women dining together. So again, well appointed, because it would have been primarily affluent people. You don't see children. And so that's another indicator that these were for affluent women who could have afforded childcare. And then finally, we get to what I call in the book cafes. Many of them were, so this is later in the century. This is as sort of the more industrial work rhythms have pushed the main meal of the day back to later after the workday is done. And dining out becomes even more of a form of commercial amusement, not just for the affluent, but also for working class people and for immigrant populations. And so this is an example of like a German beer house. You can see men and women not only dining together, but actually drinking beer together. So these spaces observed, sort of more ethnic cultural practices. Some Bostonians found this just very risque. Others embraced it and found it exciting and fun. Here's an example of an Italian eatery from the Boston Daily Globe. eating spaghetti together, drinking wine. And as, you know, as these restaurants proliferated, more native-born Americans also came to dine in these places and to sort of experiment with different kinds of foods. And then here we have a Chinese eatery from the Boston Daily Globe. Note the dog and the cat and the mice hanging in the window. So again, this is, you know, the native-born Americans who read the Boston Daily Globe were also suspicious of these immigrants and of the foods that they ate, even as they were sort of curious about them. Okay, so that's sort of a quick and dirty run through of all of the different kinds of eateries. And then I want to sort of now look a little bit more about more closely at how Bostonians work to sort out and in some cases resolve tensions between their revolutionary Republican ideals that at least to some extent rested on basic concepts of egalitarianism, with sharpening socioeconomic hierarchies caused by the development of a burgeoning market-driven industrial society. And that sounds really complicated, and it is really complicated, but let me explain, I'll unpack it. So let's use the Tremont House Hotel as an example of this. So here's that image again. So on the one hand, there's no question that the Tremont was luxurious. It was the stomping ground of the elite and the wealthy. Eating a meal there was very expensive, and it also required intimate and detailed knowledge of social etiquette rules that were beyond the grasp of most Bostonians. And yet, because restaurants like the Tremont were technically open to all, or at least all those who could afford to pay, right? Like they're not in a private home somewhere, it's a public venue. And because anyone could learn the codes of refinement practiced around the Tremont's banquet tables, especially with the spread of etiquette manuals in the first half of the 19th century, restaurants like the Tremont House became known as, quote, palaces of the people, right? As opposed to in Europe, where the idea was that, you know, these kinds of lavish dinners were available only to sort of the aristocracy. But, you know, here in America, Bostonians celebrated that in theory, anyone could go to these places and get a good meal. Okay, so that's one example of how I think Americans are working to reconcile, right, growing social hierarchy on the one hand and economic hierarchy with these egalitarian ideals. But keep in mind, not all of Boston's restaurants were as expensive as the Tremont House and other luxury hotels. And this leads to another way in which restaurants helped to work out tensions between revolutionary and Republican ideals on the one hand and growing socioeconomic inequalities and hierarchies on the other. By the 1850s, there was a type of restaurant to fit every appetite and every budget. Men from all classes, in addition to men from a variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds, participated in the trend of dining in restaurants. And increasingly, as we've seen, so did women. So while there's no doubt that 19th century restaurants were highly stratified, it was precisely because there were so many options and price points to choose from that restaurants became a broad urban trend. Eating in a restaurant became an experience that urbanites from across the socioeconomic spectrum shared, and a practice that contributed to an emerging public consumer culture that would reshape the nation. And then finally, restaurants both reflected and contributed to an urban culture that was diverse and cosmopolitan. So especially after 1870, as Boston's immigrant population became more heterogeneous, Boston's selection of eateries expanded to include German, Italian, and Chinese eateries. Originally, I started to say some of this. These ethnic restaurants appealed primarily to discrete groups of immigrants. So Italians ate in Italian eateries, Chinese ate in Chinese eateries, etc. But they soon provoked the curiosity of American-born Bostonians who became interested in the foods they served and the customs, the unique customs on display in these venues. After all, nowhere else was such intimate access to immigrant life available. What did the foreign arrivals to the city of Boston eat? How did they eat it? Native-born Americans were often eager to use ethnic restaurants as windows into these immigrant groups' cultures. So by the 1890s, Boston's number and range of ethnic eateries had become points of civic pride. For example, an 1894 headline in the Boston Daily Globe declared that in this city, there was no need to go around the globe to learn what others eat. In addition, white native-born Bostonians, particularly middle-class Bostonians, came to enjoy the sense of culinary cosmopolitanism, which was in and of itself a new form of cultural capital that dining in these ethnic eateries gave them. So knowing how to twirl spaghetti around a fork, for example, or order oolong tea in Chinatown, these became markers of worldly distinction for which world travel was not required. Now, of course, not everyone in Boston was a fan of ethnic food. On the contrary, the same period that witnessed the growing popularity of ethnic restaurants also experienced the revival of a specifically New England regional culinary identity that lashed out at the infringements ethnic foods and consumerism had made on the American diet. The colonial revival movement expressed nostalgia for a simpler past when the national menu was more homogenous and when it was prepared and eaten at home instead of at restaurants. You actually see sort of a backlash against any kind of restaurant dining late in the 19th century. And I think you can also see sort of in this picture, right, particularly the Chinese eatery, there's a curiosity, but there's also a kind of revulsion about what these immigrant cultures might eat. So to kind of wrap up, by the end of the 19th century, the growth and popularity of Boston's restaurants signaled the deep changes the city's residents had experienced in their everyday lives as Boston transitioned from a port town to a hub of the nation's powerful market capitalist economy. Just a generation before, Bostonians had eaten nearly every meal at home with their families, and now nearly all residents dined out at least occasionally, purchasing food and eating it among total strangers, right? I mean, we do that now all the time and we don't think about it, but think about what that would have been like for this generation experiencing it. It's kind of a weird thing, I think. Besides meals, Boston's restaurants provided space where Bostonians could test out new social relationships and explore new kinds of public consumer behaviors. In so doing, Bostonians and the restaurants they patronized helped to create a new urban American culture. As Boston's appetites changed, so changed the appetites of the nation. So I will stop there. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see comments.
Amazing. Thank you, Kelly. There's lots of comments in the side that are folks kind of responding to specific things you were saying in the moment. So if there's anything that doesn't make sense, feel free to ask. But I figured I would start us off with a couple kind of just questions about the work, and then give people a chance. For anyone who's watching, we do Q&A. You can just add your question to the chat of whatever place you are watching this, and we will put it on the screen once we get there. So we were talking a little bit about this earlier, and you were mentioning that this was the product of dissertation work that you had done. And I'm intrigued, like, what brought you to the topic? How did you, you kind of posed the question initially thinking about how do these, what do these kind of restaurants and eating out dining experiences have to do with kind of an early American ideal of what it meant to be this new country? And I'm curious kind of how your like path to get to that point, what did that look like?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about that. In graduate school, I really like to cook, and I still like to cook a lot. And I was kind of intrigued, like I moved to Atlanta to do my graduate work, and Atlanta is a great restaurant city, great food city. And I was intrigued that I loved dining out. I loved going to restaurants and eating all this food and stuff, but it kind of just struck me that so many of my fellow graduate students like just didn't cook for themselves and ate out all the time. And I think I sort of got kind of curious about like, when did that happen and why? And I had read, like the summer before graduate school, I had read Something from the Oven, and I'm blanking on the author now. Maybe someone can Google it and put it in the chat. But it's a great book, and I had never considered like food. I loved history. I loved, I had never really considered food as a historical source. And so I was kind of interested in that as well and wanted to do more with that. And then I'm very interested in how Americans kind of, like I kept saying, like, how do they find ways to reconcile kind of what they say is their identity, right? These egalitarian ideals with what's happening, which is increasing segmentation at all levels of society, right? And so I found that restaurants kind of provided a really fascinating window into that. That at the time, a lot of people hadn't considered. I think now culinary history has just like really taken off, but it wasn't quite as big when I started my dissertation work.
Yeah, I was really fascinated with in the conclusion of the book, you mention a bit about Howard Johnson's, the famous chain, and I was so like I was so tickled by the drawing the connection between the kind of Tremont House, which is this institution that in some ways feels so far away from kind of Howard Johnson's and ice cream and the sort of like the roof that you'd see from the highway, but being able to chart the kind of the change and the shift in American perception around food and dining out and kind of the early consumer culture. And yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, totally. And another Boston thing, right?
Totally. Okay, we've got 2 questions so far. So I'll put one on the screen first. One is asking basically about the kind of changes in the 19th century that introduced lots of new health and sanitation regulations and how kind of that and the state kind of apparatus intersected with the emergence of dining out. I don't know if that came up in your research at all.
Yeah, I think it did a bit. So I think there was lots, like I sort of alluded to, there was lots of suspicion about the cleanliness or lack thereof and sanitation in 19th century restaurants. And you see this like going way, way back into the 1820s, 1830s. And there's no, like, it's not the job of the government to regulate that per se at the time. They did regulate other aspects of eateries, mostly like whether alcohol could be served. But like, so there's fear of that. And I think I sort of argue in the book that suspicion is in part suspicion of the market itself and like seeding these like family private rituals to the market. I think in part was a way to kind of talk about that and work through some of that anxiety. But then as the century goes on, you have newspaper articles that do talk about like, that are a little bit more, I guess, reliable, where it's not just rumor. It's like this was found at this eatery and it's not clean. And you do have some, like it's really not until I didn't find any evidence that the government was really regulating that though until like the 1890s, where you do have some restaurants that sort of lost their license or got in some sort of trouble for not abiding by either health code rules or, again, alcohol rules is a common, particularly in Boston.
Yeah, that kind of ties into another question that someone asked, which was basically about the animals hanging in the Chinese restaurant window, and was the drawing best you could tell based on fact or rumor?
I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. Like, Chinese immigrants were known to eat foods that native born Americans didn't eat, right? But that's just cultural difference. I think that particular cartoon is rumor. What they imagined, I don't know. I didn't find evidence that there were actually like cats and dogs hanging in the windows of these places. But I think there was, that suspicion.
Yeah. We've got a question that is about asking to discuss a bit more about the ethnic and racial experience of dining out in Boston, especially before 1900. There was a significant Black population in Beacon Hill, and the person's interested in learning more about Asian restaurants as well.
Yeah. So in Boston, I found evidence of tremendous influence of African Americans on restaurant culture, but primarily as waiters. I didn't find much evidence of Black women being involved in the restaurant business, and that's something I talk about in the book, like why, because I would have expected to see more of that. But waiters, Black waiters in particular, were like, I mean, African American men did not have great economic options, even in Boston. They were still limited to some of the worst, most dangerous, lowest paying jobs in the city. They were residentially segregated, as this person is pointing out. But working as a restaurant waiter became kind of a niche form of employment where Black men could distinguish themselves as skilled. So it's really fascinating to me. They made a claim that waitering was a form of skilled labor and that they should be adequately compensated for that and that they should be treated with respect. And there's a movement among Black waiters to kind of like keep the occupation for themselves and not let Irish immigrant men have it. They're in the end not completely successful in that. But and they're like pamphlets written and things like that. There's a really fascinating guidebook that I talk about in the book by Tunis Campbell. I think it's called like Hotel Waiters. Oh, I'm rusty. Tunis Campbell. And he talks about all the ways in which waitering is a skilled job and hotel keepers, head waiters, housekeepers guide.
We were doing the same thing.
Okay, good job. Yeah, and you can find that online. It's been digitized. So that's primarily in Boston in the period that I researched. That's primarily the ways that I found African Americans making their mark on the restaurant business. So I don't know. Was there a second part to that question? Okay.
No, I think the person was also interested in just learning a little bit more about the Asian restaurants in Boston. I don't know exactly what, so if the person wants to add more clarification, we'll be happy to come back to that part. But for now, I will move on to the next. There were plenty of eating options and Black restaurants, but not public. Maybe people were just having covert eating businesses, but just in home.
I actually think that's probably true. And there were a couple of well-known caterers who worked in private homes and would they were African American caterers who would, cater extravagant dinners at your house, and they made excellent names for themselves. I talk a little bit about this in the book, but Shane White has a really good article. Maybe it became a book. I'm not sure. Historian Shane White, where he talks about just how hard it was for Black business owners in general, and how they don't have the same access to credit. They don't have the same access to suppliers. They have to deal largely because their banknotes were like not reliable. So if you didn't have a good reputation, people might not assume that the banknotes you were using were legitimate. So they just face all kinds of obstacles. So I absolutely agree. I think a lot of this happened sort of more covertly, and they weren't able to establish public businesses for themselves as often.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. This next person is asking how much, if at all, the rise of restaurants affected the geography of the 19th century city through the restaurant's supply chains. So I guess asked a different way, like, how did the food get to the restaurants? That
is a great question. And at one point I kind of imagined that as like a second project that I haven't gotten to. So I can't speak a lot to that, but there would be, I know a little bit enough to be dangerous, I guess. I'll attempt to answer. There were these like public markets where restaurant owners would show up to get their supplies for the day or for a few days. Yeah, I thought I was gonna. I had another thought about that that has escaped me. So they would, so I think most of it came from like rural hinterlands of Boston. So most of it locally sourced, I guess you could say. Um, One other kind of funny, amusing anecdote about that, I guess, is that I kept finding ads in newspapers throughout the century for people who would catch frogs, and for frog legs, I guess. And so like, and it would be like I could match up the person placing the ad to the city directory of who the restaurateurs or the hotel restaurant managers were. Sometimes they weren't the owner, but they managed the place. So I just think that's kind of funny. Like I imagine them collecting frogs from like little boys living around Boston.
Yeah, that is a fun image.
Yeah.
Um, we've got someone who's asking, and this kind of nicely dovetails into that, who is asking, where did you primarily find data on restaurants for the time period? Boston has great records. Just wondering how easy or hard it was to find information.
Oh, I love this question. This gets into the like doing of history, right? So this topic, I was saying a little bit before the talk started, was like the topic is kind of a needle in a haystack. Like it's everywhere and yet also very hard to find because there wasn't really like like this is the beginning of foodie culture, I guess. And so like really when I start researching, when my topic begins, like people aren't talking about what they eat. So it's difficult to find, but I did find some great. So the short answer is it's all over the city. Like it's in archives all over the city. Newspapers were also a fantastic source. I found great evidence in newspapers. City directories, like they have, they listed, city directories are kind of like phone books. They list where people lived, where they worked. They would list their employment. So I was able to find like where the restaurants were located, who owned them. I could then look up the restaurant owners in the census and find out more about them. The Harvard Business Library has great collection of done credit reports. So these were like very early credit reports on people who would take out loans, and they would go and investigate the people and their business. And so I was able to find great descriptions of the clientele of different eateries. Again, more background about the people who own them. I did find some great diaries in the end. The one, Benjamin Crowninshield that I start the book with. There's a little boy, Charles Wiggins. His diaries at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and he was not very old. I want to say he was a teenager, but he was obsessed with going out to eat, and he would like kind of cajole his like wealthy adult like parents' friends to take him to these different places. There's a great scene in his diary where he talks about he wanted to go eat at the Parker House Hotel right when it opened, which was another like really elite eatery. And he and his friend go there, and then they like can't afford anything on the menu. They realize they haven't brought enough money with them. And so they sneak out, and then he gets somebody to take him back a few weeks later. And he talks about how just exquisite the food is. I think he eats like brain cheese, head cheese. So yeah, so this was a really fun topic to read about. Thank you
Yeah,
for.
I've just put, yeah, I'm putting a link right now to the Boston Public Library has a LibGuide that's all about the city directories. And so for anyone that's interested in seeing some digitized city directories, they have ones going back from, the first one is 1789 and the latest one is actually from 1974. So you can get quite a range.
You can learn so much from the city directories. And they weren't digitized when I was doing this. So I sat in the basement of the library with a microfiche machine. But
I know. There's been so many new fun things that have gotten digitized since you were writing this. Okay, I think we've got one more question that I can see. So if anyone else has been sitting on a question, now's your time to stick it in the chat. But this person is asking, I've been told that in the South End, there were many restaurants, in quotes, in the lower levels of buildings, in part because the buildings had been converted to boarding houses and many single men living in small rooms had no access to kitchens, so they needed some place to eat. Do you know more about this? Were they really restaurants as we would think of them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say, yes, it is true. The South End was like, had tons of boarding houses, particularly late in the century. That's what the last chapter of my book is largely about. And yeah, there weren't kitchens. Um, some boarding houses provided meals, some didn't. Just because the boarding house provided you a meal didn't mean you actually wanted to eat it. So these kinds of eateries proliferated. And yes, they were in the basement. Rent was cheap there. And yeah, I think that's really where you have different. I think that's where a lot of the ethnic eateries in particular proliferated in the last part of the century. And then I think late in the century too, you have some changes where more working class women start going out to eat, and so they're not as male dominated because women are also, they have access to more like factory jobs and have more of the need to go out to eat just as the men do. And it's also a form of entertainment, right? It's a way to escape your small room of your boarding house.
Yeah. Well, just hearing that, I don't know why this made me think of it, but I do have one more question, which is the period of time that you cover in the book spans quite a bit of time, but it's kind of both before and partially during the period of time when Boston is annexing a lot of its neighboring towns and I guess suburbs, although that's not really how they would have been considered at the time. And I'm curious if this kind of like restaurant dining out culture expanded. Was that in other places, or was it sort of just in Boston because it was the metropolis, or did you see it also in kind of further out, like West Roxbury or Roxbury, or was it kind of more kind of kept towards Boston?
My impression is that the period that I study, it's really more in these like kind of sprawling urban areas. Like you see the same thing in other cities like New York, for example, or Philadelphia. But like there were some eateries out in the suburbs, but maybe like one or two, and they were like had a particular clientele, or like they were associated with like a particular like hotel or something like that.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. Well, I think that is all the questions we had in the chat. So thank you very much for joining us. I will remind everyone that is watching, if you enjoyed today's program, we're so glad. Stay tuned. We have more planned for the fall. And there's always more ways you can kind of stay involved with what we're up to. The best way to do that is to get on our newsletter, which is you can subscribe to from our website. And this talk is actually coming right at the tail end of our current exhibition, as I mentioned earlier, which closes on August 23rd. So you have another perhaps 9 days of time to go see the show if you haven't seen it in person. And our public gallery will reopen on September 9th with the new exhibition, Getting Around Town, 4 Centuries of Mapping Boston in Transit. So if you are a transportation nerd or want to come see how the current way you get in and around Boston came to be, come check that out. And keep your eye on our public events calendar, because we're going to be releasing our fall public events schedule soon. But I will just extend another thank you to Kelly, and thank you to everyone who joined us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was fun.
Yeah, of course.